3:22 in the morning, Kadena Air Base on the island of Okinawa. The ANSPY-6 radar at the nearby Marine Corps facility registered a high-altitude ballistic trajectory that was not supposed to be there. In less than 4 minutes, the Pacific's largest American air hub would become the target of a precision-guided Russian Iskander-M ballistic missile. The tropical night air was heavy with humidity and the faint smell of jet fuel from the previous day's sorties. The surrounding city of Kadena was dark, sleeping under a cloudless sky that offered no warning of the kinetic energy descending from the edge of space at Mach 6. The missile had been launched from a mobile platform over 1,000 kilometers to the north, crossing the Sea of Japan in a high-arcing flight path. As it re-entered the lower atmosphere, the guidance fins adjusted the trajectory, steering the 1,000-pound high-explosive warhead toward the southern aircraft parking aprons. On the ground, the early warning sirens began, their piercing wail only 12 seconds before the impact, leaving the ground crews and security forces with no time to reach the hardened shelters. At exactly 3:26 in the morning, the warhead detonated 50 meters above the concrete tarmac at coordinates 26 degrees, 21 minutes north, 127 degrees, 46 minutes east. The initial blast wave moved at supersonic speeds, shattering the reinforced glass in the air traffic control tower and flattening the maintenance hangars nearest to the explosion. The heat from the detonation was so intense, it instantly ignited the fuel lines of 3 aircraft parked in a neat row, turning the southern apron into a lake of fire. The primary target of the strike appeared to be the concentrated flight line of the 18th Wing. 8 F-15 Eagle fighters, each worth $30 million, were caught in the open during a routine maintenance cycle. The shrapnel from the Iskander-M airburst shredded the thin aluminum skins of the fighters, puncturing fuel tanks and hydraulic lines. Within seconds, the first 15 erupted in a secondary explosion that sent its vertical stabilizers flying 50 meters into the air, landing in a crumpled heap near the runway. The destruction did not stop with the tactical fighters. Parked less than 100 meters away were 6 KC-100 and 35 Stratotankers, the massive aerial refueling platforms essential for long-range operations in the Pacific. These aircraft were fully loaded with thousands of gallons of P-8 jet fuel. When the blast wave struck the first tanker, the wing structure collapsed, causing the fuel to spill and ignite. A chain reaction followed as the fire jumped from one tanker to the next, creating a wall of black smoke and orange flame that rose 300 meters into the night sky. The physical damage was catastrophic. 14 aircraft, including the 8 fighters and 6 tankers, were rendered total losses in a matter of seconds. The concrete of the southern apron was cratered and scorched, with pieces of landing gear and engine turbines scattered across a 300-meter radius. The pressure wave from the explosion was felt 10 kilometers away, rattling windows in Naha and alerting the Japanese self-defense forces that the red line had been crossed. On the base, the immediate aftermath was a scene of controlled chaos and professional desperation. Airmen who had been thrown to the ground by the blast scrambled to their feet, their ears ringing from the overpressure. The smell of burning rubber, scorched metal, and chemical fire suppressants filled the air, choking those who tried to approach the burning wreckage. Emergency response teams from the Air Force Fire Protection units were already moving, their heavy trucks racing toward the inferno, even as secondary explosions from aircraft ammunition continued to rock the flight line. Despite the devastation, the base leadership immediately initiated the transition to a combat footing. The commanding officer of the 18th Wing issued the order for all surviving aircraft to prepare for immediate relocation to alternate airfields. The runway itself, although littered with debris, appeared to have escaped direct hit, though the taxiways leading to the southern apron were blocked by burning wreckage. The United States military in the Pacific was no longer a prophet at peace, and the price of the first strike had been paid in some of its most valuable aerial assets. 3:28 in the morning. The southern flight line of Kadena Air Base was a landscape of melting aluminum and secondary detonations. The first responders of the 18th Civil Engineer Squadron Fire Protection Flight drove their Oshkosh P-19 fire trucks directly into the searing heat of the burning fuel lakes. The air was thick with the acrid stink of vaporized JP-8 fuel and the chemical bite of fire-retardant foam. As the massive 8-wheel trucks surged across the tarmac, the roof-mounted turrets swung toward the remains of the Stratotankers, unleashing a high-pressure deluge of aqueous film-forming foam. The white chemical blankets spread across the concrete, struggling to smother the orange flames that roared 3 stories high. Inside the cabs of the fire trucks, the heat was so intense it began to blister the red paint on the hoods. The firefighters worked in a world of orange and black, their visibility limited to less than 10 meters by the dense, oily smoke. Every few seconds, the ground would shudder as a tire on a burning aircraft exploded, or a pressurized hydraulic line ruptured, sending a spray of fire into the air. Despite the danger of further missile strikes, the crews remained on the line, focused on containing the inferno before it could reach the main fuel farm, located less than 500 meters to the east. While the firefighters fought the fire on the southern apron, a different kind of urgency gripped the northern sector of the base. Inside the hardened aircraft shelters, pilots and ground crews of the 12th Marine Aircraft Group were executing a desperate scramble. 12 F-35 Bravo Lightning II fighters had survived the initial strike because they were housed behind 4 feet of reinforced concrete and steel. The order from Pacific Air Forces was absolute: launch every operational airframe immediately to prevent their destruction on the ground. The massive steel doors of the shelters slid open with a heavy mechanical grind, revealing the jagged silhouettes of the stealth fighters. The whine of the Pratt & Whitney Phone 135 engines rose to a deafening scream, a sound that cut through the roar of the fires. The pilots, wearing their advanced helmet-mounted displays, monitored the tactical situation through the aircraft's distributed aperture system, which allowed them to see through the smoke and darkness as if it were daylight. The ground crews worked with a frantic, disciplined speed that had been honed through hundreds of hours of drills. They pulled the chocks and signaled the aircraft forward into the smoke-filled night. Because the southern taxiways were blocked by the wreckage of the 18th Wing, the F-35 Bravo fighters were forced to use their short takeoff capability. Each pilot pushed their throttle to the stops, the blue-white flame of the afterburners illuminating the scorched earth, as the jets accelerated down the remaining 3,000 feet of clear runway. By 3:38 in the morning, the first 4-ship flight of F-35 Bravos was airborne, banking hard to the west over the East China Sea. As they climbed to 20,000 feet, the pilots looked back at their base. From the air, Kadena looked like a jagged wound in the darkness of Okinawa, a massive circle of fire and smoke that could be seen for 50 miles. The radar screens in their cockpits were already beginning to fill with data shared from the Navy destroyers offshore, showing that the first strike might have been only the beginning. On the ground, the logistics of the scramble were taking a heavy toll. Maintainers who had been working for 18 hours straight were now lifting heavy ordnance and fueling hoses in the middle of a combat zone. The air smelled of burnt rubber and the metallic tang of oxygen systems. Every man and woman on the flight line knew that a second wave of missiles could be detected at any moment, turning their current position into a kill zone. The coordination between the Air Force fire teams and the Marine Corps flight crews was a testament to the integrated nature of the United States military response. As the last of the operational fighters cleared the runway, the fire trucks moved to block the access roads, creating a buffer zone between the active fires and the surviving infrastructure. The 18th Wing had been bloodied, and 14 aircraft were gone, but the surviving force was now fueled, armed, and climbing into the dark sky to find the source of the strike. 3:45 in the morning. The East China Sea, 80 miles northwest of Okinawa. The guided missile destroyer DDG-76, USS Higgins, was already at maximum alert when its ANSPY-6 radar suite detected a cluster of high-velocity signatures rising from the Asian mainland. The sea was a deep, restless charcoal color under the pre-dawn sky, and the air inside the Combat Information Center smelled of ozone and recycled air. What had begun as a localized strike on Kadena Air Base was now expanding into a massive, coordinated saturation attack intended to finish what the first missile had started. The Aegis combat system, linked via satellite to the destroyer USS Howard, 10 miles to the south, instantly categorized the 18 incoming threats as a mix of Iskander-M and Zircon hypersonic missiles. Inside the hull of the USS Higgins, the fire control officers worked with a quiet, practiced intensity, their hands hovering over the glass consoles of the multi-mission weapons system. The commander of the 7th Fleet had already authorized a weapons-free posture, and the ships were operating under a decentralized command structure to maximize their reaction time. At coordinates 27 degrees 12 minutes north, 126 degrees 46 minutes east, the first of the Mark 41 vertical launch system cells erupted. A Standard Missile-3 interceptor shrieked into the night, its solid rocket booster leaving a blinding white trail that reflected off the dark water for miles. The physical shock of the launch vibrated through the 8,900-ton hull, a rhythmic pounding that rattled the steel bulkheads and the racks in the sailors' berthing areas. 3 seconds later, another 4 cells opened in rapid succession, launching a salvo of Standard Missile-6s to create a layered defensive umbrella over the strike group. The deck of the destroyer was washed in a brilliant, flickering orange light as the missiles cleared the ship, their exhaust plumes carving jagged lines through the humid Pacific air. The smell of burning solid propellant drifted across the bridge, a sharp chemical scent that signaled the beginning of the most complex air defense engagement in the history of the United States Navy. The engagement took place 60 miles above the Earth, where the kinetic kill vehicle of the Standard Missile-3 slammed into the lead Russian warhead at a combined closing speed of 15,000 kilometers per hour. There was no sound in the vacuum of space, only a silent, brilliant flash of white light that signaled the total destruction of the incoming ballistic threat. On the radar screens in the Combat Information Center, the first green icon vanished, replaced by a momentary cloud of debris before the computer recalculated the remaining trajectories. As the second wave moved into the mid-course phase, the USS Howard launched its own interceptors, filling the sky with 24 additional missiles. The Aegis system functioned perfectly, assigning each interceptor to a specific target and adjusting their flight paths in real time to account for the erratic maneuvering of the hypersonic Zircon warheads. The air above the East China Sea was soon crisscrossed with the white ribbons of missile trails, a chaotic web of fire that stretched from the horizon to the edge of the atmosphere. The results of the engagement were a testament to decades of American technological investment and training. Of the 18 missiles in the second volley, the Aegis shield successfully intercepted 16 before they could reach the terminal phase. The remaining 2 missiles were targeted by the ship's electronic warfare suites, which flooded the incoming seekers with high-powered radio frequency interference. One missile veered wildly off course and tumbled into the ocean, while the second was destroyed by a final, desperate burst from the 20mm close-in weapon system. By 4 in the morning, the radar screens were clear of incoming threats, though the ships remained at general quarters. The USS Higgins and USS Howard had expended $64 million worth of interceptors in 15 minutes, but they had saved the remaining infrastructure at Kadena from certain destruction. The crew, sweat-soaked and exhausted, maintained their stations, knowing that the defensive success of the morning would likely lead to an offensive response by the Pentagon within the hour. 4:15 in the morning. The Sea of Japan, 300 miles north of the Tsushima Strait, the P-8 Poseidon, call sign Trident 7-5, was operating in international airspace at an altitude of 24,000 feet. The Maritime Patrol Aircraft, a modified Boeing 737, was packed with sensitive acoustic processors and electronic intelligence suites. Its mission was to monitor Russian submarine movements in the deep trenches of the sea, but the tactical environment had shifted from observation to active survival. The air inside the pressurized cabin was cool and smelled of dry electronics and the coffee the 9 crew members had been drinking to stay sharp during the long patrol. 2 Russian Su-35 fighters had been shadowing the P-8 Poseidon for 20 minutes. The intercept had grown increasingly aggressive, with the Russian pilots performing high-speed passes within 20 feet of the American aircraft's wingtips. At coordinates 38 degrees 12 minutes north, 132 degrees 45 minutes east, the lead Su-35 pulled ahead and executed a violent barrel roll, crossing the nose of the Poseidon and buffeting the larger plane with its jet wash. The flight commander of Trident 7-5 maintained a steady course, broadcasting on the international distress frequency that they were a non-combatant aircraft in international waters. The response was a silent, lethal escalation. The ALR-67 radar warning receiver in the Poseidon cockpit began a steady, rhythmic chirping, indicating a hard radar lock from the second Russian fighter. 5 seconds later, the chirping turned into a continuous, high-pitched scream. A single AA-12 air-to-air missile had been released from the Russian fighter's starboard pylon. The P-8 Poseidon was never designed for dogfighting. The pilot banked the heavy aircraft into a maximum rate turn, the airframe groaning under the stress of 3 times the force of gravity. The electronic warfare operator punched the flare release, sending a sequence of magnesium Teflon decoys into the freezing morning air. The flares burned with a blinding white light, creating a heat signature designed to pull the missile away from the engines. It was not enough. The AA-12 missile, guided by its internal active radar seeker, ignored the flares and corrected its terminal flight path. The warhead detonated 10 meters behind the No. 2 engine on the right wing. The explosion was a sharp, metallic crack that echoed through the fuselage, followed immediately by the sound of thousands of tiny fragments of shrapnel shredding the composite skin of the wing. The right engine disintegrated instantly, its turbine blades turning into jagged projectiles that sliced through the fuel lines and the hydraulic flight controls. The Poseidon shuddered violently, the nose pitching down as the flight deck filled with smoke and the orange glow of master caution lights. The pilot and co-pilot fought the controls, but the right wing was already a mass of twisted metal and fire. At 15,000 feet, the order was given to abandon the aircraft. The crew moved with the mechanical precision of their training, donning their survival vests and moving toward the main cabin door as the aircraft entered a terminal spiral toward the black water below. The aircraft struck the surface of the Sea of Japan at 4:21 in the morning. The impact was not a landing, but a disintegration, as the 500-mile-per-hour momentum tore the fuselage into 3 distinct sections. A massive plume of white spray and debris rose 50 meters into the air, before the cold, dark water began to swallow the remains of the $40 million platform. Back at Kadena Air Base and aboard the ships of the 7th Fleet, the sudden disappearance of Trident 7-5 from the tactical data link triggered an immediate search and rescue activation. 2 MH-60 Sierra helicopters, stationed aboard a nearby cruiser, were airborne within 8 minutes. The rescue crews knew the clock was their primary enemy. The water temperature in the Sea of Japan was only 45 degrees, giving any survivors in the water less than 30 minutes before the onset of severe hypothermia. As the sun began to break over the horizon, the MH-60 Sierra crews arrived at the last known coordinates. They found a debris field stretching for 2 kilometers, marked by the iridescent sheen of jet fuel and the bright orange of 2 deployed life rafts. The rescue swimmers prepared to deploy, their eyes scanning the waves for the green sea dye markers used by the crew. The United States Navy had lost a premier surveillance asset and 9 highly trained personnel were in the water, but the mission of recovery was now the only priority in a theater that was rapidly descending into a state of total war. 4:45 in the morning, the 36th Medical Group Hospital at Kadena Air Base. The facility was operating under a mass casualty protocol that had been triggered exactly 45 minutes after the first missile impact. The sterile, fluorescent-lit corridors smelled of sharp antiseptic and the faint, lingering scent of burning jet fuel drifting in through the pressurized ambulance bay doors. Doctors, nurses, and medical technicians, their boots squeaking on the polished linoleum floors as they fought to stabilize the first wave of wounded airmen. Outside, in the pre-dawn darkness, the triage area had been established under portable floodlights that bleached the asphalt a ghostly white. The lead triage officer, a colonel, with 20 years of trauma experience, used a black marker to categorize each patient arriving from the southern flight line. The system was absolute: red for immediate life-threatening injuries, yellow for delayed, green for minor, and black for those who could no longer be helped. The primary challenge for the medical teams was the nature of the injuries caused by the Iskander-M warhead. Of the 42 personnel admitted in the first hour, 19 suffered from severe thermal burns caused by the secondary fuel explosions on the aircraft parking aprons. Another 12 airmen presented with blast overpressure injuries, including ruptured eardrums and internal hemorrhaging caused by the supersonic shockwave that had flattened the maintenance hangars. The remaining 11 patients had been struck by high-velocity shrapnel that had shredded protective gear and bone with equal indifference. In Operating Room 3A, surgical team worked to save the leg of a 22-year-old staff sergeant who had been caught near the first 15 Eagle explosion. The room was a sanctuary of high-tech medicine amidst the chaos of the base, filled with the rhythmic beeping of cardiac monitors and the mechanical hiss of an advanced ventilator. The surgeons used specialized vascular clamps to stop the arterial bleeding, while a technician monitored the 4 units of O-negative blood being pumped into the patient's cooling body. The logistics of the golden hour were being tested to their absolute limit. This critical 60-minute window was the difference between survival and death for those in the red category. To maintain the pace, the hospital commander authorized the use of the emergency blood bank, which held 200 units of whole blood and plasma specifically for a theater-wide escalation. Every 30 seconds, a new radio report came in from the field, providing updates on the number of casualties still being pulled from the smoking ruins of the hangars. Despite the intensity of the medical effort, staff remained tethered to the larger tactical reality. A ruggedized laptop at the nurses' station displayed the base's internal defense status, showing that the airfield was still at a high state of alert. The medical teams knew that if a third wave of missiles penetrated the Aegis shield, their hospital, despite its Red Cross markings, could become a target. They worked with their chemical defense masks hanging from their waists, ready to transition to a contaminated environment at a moment's notice. By 5:15 in the morning, the first wave of casualties had been stabilized or moved into intensive care. The hospital had successfully processed 42 patients with 0 deaths, occurring after arrival at the facility, a testament to the speed of the Air Force fire and rescue teams on the flight line. However, the atmosphere remained heavy with the realization that 14 of their comrades had been killed instantly in the initial blast, their remains still being recovered from the scorched concrete of the southern apron. As a fresh team of surgeons prepared for the next shift, the sound of MH-60 Sierra helicopters could be heard approaching from the west. These were the rescue birds, returning from the Sea of Japan, carrying the survivors of the P-8 Poseidon shootdown. The emergency room doors swung open once more, and the cycle of the golden hour began again, a professional defiance against the violence that had been visited upon the island. 6 in the morning, high over the Sea of Japan, 40,000 feet above the gray morning mist. 3 B-2 Spirit stealth bombers, having flown a non-stop mission from Whiteman Air Force Base in Missouri, were leveling off for their final weapons release. The bat-winged silhouettes were invisible to the Russian early warning radars sweeping the coast of the Primorsky Krai region. Inside the cockpit of the lead aircraft, the 2-man crew operated in a world of muted green displays and the low hum of the environmental control system. The air smelled of dry oxygen and the faint metallic tang of the cockpit's composite shielding. The authorization for a proportional response had been transmitted via the Global Sentinel satellite network signed by the commander of Indo-Pacific Command. The strategic objective was the neutralization of the Russian missile brigade responsible for the strike on Kadena. The target was a concealed mobile launch complex located at coordinates 43 degrees 7 minutes north, 100 day, and 31 degrees 55 minutes east. This was a forested valley 30 miles north of Vladivostok, where 4 Iskander-M transporter erector launcher vehicles were attempting to reload under the cover of a dense canopy. The bomber's massive internal weapons bay doors cycled open with a heavy mechanical thud. that resonated through the titanium airframe. The trigger was squeezed. 16 JASSM extended-range cruise missiles dropped into the freezing void, their stubby wings flicking open as they fell away from the mothership. The small turbojet engines ignited with a high-pitched scream, a white column of fire punching backward through the thin air. The heat blast from the simultaneous ignitions washed across the bottom of the B-2 Spirit bomber, the temperature rising momentarily to 1,000 degrees before the missiles accelerated toward the Russian coast. The 16 missiles separated into 4 distinct flight paths, skimming just 50 meters above the jagged terrain to avoid detection. They moved at 500 miles per hour, guided by a combination of encrypted GPS and an internal infrared seeker that compared the terrain below to a preloaded digital map. As the missiles crossed the final ridgeline, the seekers locked on to the heat signatures of the Russian mobile launchers, which were still warm from their earlier operations. The first warhead punched straight through the reinforced cab of the lead transporter erector launcher, the 1,000-pound high-explosive penetrator driving 3 meters into the ground before detonating. The explosion was not a single boom, but a series of catastrophic ruptures as the missile's remaining fuel and ready-to-fire Iskander rockets were sympathetic to the blast. The 10-ton vehicle was lifted 2 meters off the ground, its steel chassis twisting like paper before the entire unit erupted in a blinding white flash. 6 tons of armor and hydraulic equipment were sent flying into the surrounding forest, stripping the trees of their needles and bark for a 50-meter radius. The Russian defenders reacted with a mixture of panic and disciplined desperation. An S-400 surface-to-air missile battery, located 5 miles to the north, detected the impacts and immediately went to high-power radar illumination. 2 interceptor missiles were launched into the smoke-filled sky, their rocket motors roaring as they sought out the remaining American cruise missiles. But the American weapons were already on their terminal dives. The Russian crew members near the launch site abandoned their posts, running for the safety of nearby bunkers, as the sky above them filled with the shrieking sound of incoming ordnance. A second and third cruise missile slammed into the brigade's command and control vehicle and the primary fuel tanker. The resulting fireball was so intense it bleached the morning sky white, casting long, flickering shadows across the valley. The temperature in the center of the impact zone reached 3,000 degrees, vaporizing the rubber tires and melting the aluminum housings of the communication gear. Black smoke boiled out of the crater, rising in a dense column that would be visible to satellite reconnaissance for the next 12 hours. The immediate aftermath was a landscape of dead silence and charred metal. The Russian missile brigade had been effectively erased from the order of battle. The burning wreckage of the launchers was still settling into the blackened earth when the 3 B-2 Spirit bombers turned back. Toward the east, their mission of retaliation complete. The strike had been precise, proportional, and devastating. The United States had signaled that the cost of attacking Okinawa would be the total destruction of the assets used in the strike. 6:30 in the morning. The sky over the Sea of Japan was a pale, bruising purple as the sun climbed behind a thick layer of overcast clouds. The 3 B-2 Spirit bombers were egressing to the east when the radar warning receivers on their escorting fighters began to scream. 4 Russian Su-57 fighters had scrambled from an interceptor base near Vladivostok, moving at twice the speed of sound to catch the American strike package before it reached the safety of Japanese airspace. Providing the high-altitude screen were 2 F-22 Raptors from the 19th Fighter Squadron, which had been orbiting at 45,000 feet in a state of silent, passive monitoring. The tactical situation transitioned from a tense shadow play to an open kinetic engagement in less than 10 seconds. The lead F-22 Raptor pilot, call sign Dagger 0-1, received a handoff from a nearby E-2 Charlie Hawkeye surveillance aircraft. The Russian interceptors were flying in a wide finger four formation, their powerful radars sweeping the sky for the stealthy American bombers. The air inside the Raptor cockpit was pressurized and quiet, the only sound the steady rhythm of the pilot's oxygen regulator. The pilot of the F-22 Raptor squeezed the trigger on the right-hand control stick, initiating the second exchange of the morning. An AIM-120 missile shrieked out of the internal weapons bay, a white column of fire punching backward through the freezing thin air. The heat blast from the rocket motor washed across the specialized stealth coating of the Raptor's fuselage, the temperature jumping hundreds of degrees in a millisecond. The missile accelerated instantly to Mach 4, its solid fuel motor leaving a jagged white scar against the purple horizon. The missile traveled 20 miles in 30 seconds, its internal active radar seeker locking onto the lead Su-57 fighter. The warhead punched straight through the left engine intake of the Russian jet, detonating the internal fuel cells and the titanium turbine blades. The aircraft erupted instantly into a brilliant orange fireball that bleached the surrounding clouds white. The fuselage shattered into 3 distinct burning sections that were sent flying across the sky, leaving a trail of black smoke and molten debris that fell toward the cold water 5 miles below. The remaining Russian pilots reacted with a mixture of shock and disciplined aggression. The second Su-57 fighter wrenched its nose hard to the right, pulling 7 times the force of gravity to break the potential lock of a second missile. The pilot fired a frantic flurry of magnesium flares that illuminated the cockpit glass with a flickering, ghostly light. He dove toward the thicker air at lower altitudes, his breathing heavy and ragged as he struggled to regain situational awareness. Despite the evasive maneuvers, the American tactical advantage remained absolute. The second F-22 Raptor had already moved into a flanking position, launching 2 additional AIM-9 Sidewinder missiles. These heat-seeking weapons ignored the flares and locked onto the massive thermal signature of the Russian afterburners. The second Russian aircraft was hit in the tail section, the explosion severing the hydraulic lines and sending the jet into an unrecoverable flat spin. The pilot ejected, his parachute a tiny orange dot against the vast, empty gray of the Sea of Japan. The immediate aftermath was a landscape of scattered smoke. The 2 remaining Russian fighters, realizing they were outmatched and outpositioned, broke contact and fled toward the mainland at maximum speed. The air where the lead Su-57 had been was now occupied only by a drifting cloud of carbon fiber dust and the smell of burnt kerosene. The radio frequency for the Russian flight lead remained silent for exactly 10 seconds before erupting in a series of frantic, overlapping voices from the ground controllers in Vladivostok. The F-22 Raptors did not pursue the retreating survivors. Their mission was the protection of the B-2 Spirit bombers, which were now crossing the coastline of northern Japan. The engagement had lasted exactly 3 minutes and 45 seconds, resulting in the confirmed destruction of 2 fifth-generation Russian fighters for 0 American losses. The balance of power in the sky had been reasserted, but the pilots knew that the Russian Air Force would not allow such a humiliating defeat to go unanswered for long. 8:30 in the morning, the main runway of Kadena Air Base. The first C-17 Globemaster III, part of a continuous air bridge from Joint Base Pearl Harbor Hickam in Hawaii, touched down on the scorched asphalt. The massive transport aircraft reversed its 4 engines with a thunderous roar, blowing a cloud of gray ash and debris away from the touchdown point. The air over the airfield was finally clearing of smoke, but it remained heavy with the smell of burnt rubber and the industrial exhaust of heavy machinery. This aircraft, belonging to the 15th Wing, was the lead element of a logistics surge designed to stabilize the base before the sun reached its zenith. Inside the cavernous cargo hold of the C-17 were 60 tons of critical supplies, including 2 spare engines for the surviving 15 Eagle fighters and 400 cases of advanced medical trauma kits. Were 60 tons of critical supplies, including 2 spare engines for the surviving 15 Eagle fighters and 400 cases of advanced medical trauma kits. As the rear ramp lowered, a team of 30 specialized maintainers from the 18th Wing sprinted into the hold to begin the offloading process. They moved with the frantic, rhythmic precision of a pit crew, knowing that every minute the transport sat on the ground was a minute it remained a target for a potential follow-up strike. Following closely behind the first transport was a second C-17, carrying the advanced party of the 554th Red Horse Squadron. These heavy construction engineers were the Air Force's primary tool for rapid airfield recovery. They arrived with 75 specialized construction vehicles and 125 pallets of rapid-setting concrete. Their mission was clear. The craters on the southern taxiways had to be filled and leveled within 6 hours to allow for movement of heavy refueling tankers. The logistics of the recovery effort extended far beyond the flight line. In the base gymnasium, which had been converted into a temporary reception center, 300 fresh personnel from various Pacific commands were being processed. These were the replacements for the airmen lost or injured in the initial blast, including sensor operators, security forces, and fuel specialists. The air in the gymnasium was cool and smelled of floor wax and nervous energy, a sharp contrast to the humid, chemical-scented chaos of the southern apron, just a mile away. On the eastern side of the base, the fuels management flight was overseeing the arrival of a massive replenishment convoy. Because the primary fuel farm had been narrowly missed by the Iskander-M strike, the priority was now to refill the depleted storage tanks. 12,000-gallon fuel trucks, escorted by Japanese Self-Defense Force security teams, moved in a continuous loop between the base and the plane, Naval Fuel Pier at White Beach. The sound of the heavy diesel engines was a constant, low-frequency vibration that signaled the base was returning to a functional combat posture. The Iron Bridge from Hawaii and the continental United States was not just about hardware, it was about the psychological stabilization of the theater. By 9:15 in the morning, 4 more C-17 transports were in the pattern, their landing lights cutting through the hazy morning light. The sheer volume of incoming material, from palletized drinking water to sophisticated radar components, demonstrated that the United States military logistics machine was fully engaged. While the engineers worked to patch the concrete and the maintainers labored to get the surviving fighters back into the air. The medical teams at the dock hospital received a fresh shipment of 60 units of specialized burn treatment supplies. The logistics of care were as vital as the logistics of combat. The golden hour had passed, and the mission had transitioned into long-term recovery and sustained readiness. By the time the last C-17 of the first wave departed for the return trip to Hawaii, the southern apron of Kadena looked less like a graveyard and more like a construction site. The wreckage of the 14 destroyed aircraft had been dragged to a secure area for investigation, and the first of the Red Horse craters was already being filled with high-strength polymer. The cost of the morning had been devastating, but the arrival of the logistics surge proved that the base could not be put out of action by a single strike. The infrastructure of the 18th Wing was being rebuilt in real time, one pallet and one plane load at a time. 10:30 in the morning, the Tactical Operations Center at Kadena Air Base. The smoke from the southern flight line had finally settled into a thin, gray haze that clung to the humid Okinawa air. The official damage assessment report, compiled by the 18th Wing's command staff, was transmitted to Indo-Pacific Command at exactly 10:35. The report was a clinical, cold-eyed tally of the most significant single-day loss of American air power since the end of the Vietnam War. At coordinates 26 degrees, 21 minutes north, 127 degrees, 46 minutes east, the cratered tarmac stood as a silent witness to the lethality of modern ballistic missile technology. The hardware losses were absolute. 14 aircraft had been struck from the active inventory. This included 8 FA-15 Eagle fighters, each a cornerstone of regional air superiority, and 6 KC-135 Stratotankers of the Pacific Theater. The financial cost of the airframes alone was estimated at $780 million. However, the true strategic cost was higher. The destruction of the tankers had effectively reduced the operational range of every other fighter squadron on the island by 40% until the arrival of the logistics surge from Hawaii. The infrastructure damage was equally severe. 4 maintenance hangars, including the specialized avionics repair facility, had been reduced to twisted skeletons of steel and scorched insulation. 200,000 square feet of the southern parking apron required total reconstruction due to the thermal cracking caused by the burning jet fuel. The air smelled of wet ash and the metallic scent of pulverized aluminum. Despite the intensity of the strike, the primary 3,000-meter runway remained operational, a critical factor that allowed the air bridge from Hawaii to continue without interruption. The human cost was the most heavy burden for the 18th Wing. 14 personnel had been confirmed killed in action during the initial impact and the subsequent firefighting efforts. 42 others were being treated for injuries, ranging from severe burns to blast-induced trauma. The names of the fallen were being withheld pending notification of next of kin, but the atmosphere in the base's common areas was one of somber, quiet resolve. There was no outward display of grief, only a professional focus on the tasks required to bring the base back to a full combat posture. In response to the assessment, the commander of the 7th Fleet ordered a radical shift in defensive posture, known as agile combat employment. Not be concentrated on a single large base, where they were vulnerable to saturation strikes. By 11 in the morning, 12 F-35 Bravo fighters and the surviving FA-15 Eagles were being dispersed to 3 different civilian airfields across the Ryukyu Islands. This maneuver turned the single target of Kadena into a moving, distributed network that would be nearly impossible for the Russian missile brigades to target effectively in a second wave. To protect the recovery efforts, a battery of MIM-104 Patriot missiles was relocated from the northern end of the island to the perimeter of the southern flight line. The olive-drab canisters of the missile launchers were angled toward the northern horizon, their radars scanning the sky with a constant, invisible pulse. The air around the battery hummed with the sound of portable generators, a mechanical reminder that the base was now a frontline fortification. The assessment concluded with a defiant note on readiness. While the 18th Wing had lost 14 aircraft, its command and control infrastructure was intact. Its primary runway was clear, and its personnel were already integrated with the fresh reinforcements, arriving from the continental United States. The strike had been a tactical success for the Russian forces, but it had failed to achieve the strategic objective of neutralizing Kadena as a launch platform for American power. As the sun reached its peak, the base was no longer a target recovering from a blow. It was a hardened hub of activity. The smell of fresh concrete from the Red Horse, longer a target recovering from a blow. It was a hardened hub of activity. The smell of fresh concrete from the Red Horse was now leaning forward into the next phase of the conflict. The 14 lost aircraft would be replaced, but the lessons learned in the fire of 3:26 in the morning would change the way the Pacific was defended forever. 12 noon. The East China Sea, 60 miles west of the Ryukyu Islands. The aircraft carrier, USS Gerald R. Ford, was carving a massive white wake through the deep blue water at a speed of 30 knots. On its 4-acre flight deck, the air smelled of salt, spray, and the high-temperature exhaust of FA-18 Super Hornets and F-35 Bravo fighters. The arrival of the carrier strike group, less than 9 hours after the first missile impact at Kadena, signaled the completion of the immediate United States reinforcement plan. The Pacific was no longer a theater of potential conflict. It was now an active combat zone where every EPS mile of airspace was contested by the most advanced technology on the planet. The strategic resolution of the morning's engagement was defined by a shift toward what the Pentagon called distributed lethality. While the 14 destroyed aircraft at Kadena represented a significant tactical blow, the Russian objective of neutralizing American air power in the region had failed. By early afternoon, the surviving 24 FA-15 Eagles and 12 F-35 Bravos were operating from 4 different locations, including a hardened Japanese self-defense force base on Kyushu and a reinforced civilian highway strip on the island of Miyako. This dispersal meant that any future Russian strike would have to find and hit 6 targets instead of 1, a task that exhausted their satellite reconnaissance capabilities. The Domdon final tally of the engagement was recorded in a classified after-action report that would be studied for a generation. On the American side, the cost was heavy. 14 high-value aircraft destroyed on the ground, 14 personnel killed in action, and 42 wounded. Additionally, 1 P-8 Poseidon had been lost over the Sea of Japan, though 7 of its 9 crew members had been successfully recovered by the MH-60 Sierra helicopters. On the Russian side, the cost was equally severe, and an entire mobile missile brigade had been obliterated by B-2 Spirit bombers, and 2 fifth-generation Su-57 fighters had been shot down by F-22 Raptors. Despite the losses, the professional consensus within Indo-Pacific Command was that the defensive systems had performed above expectations. The Aegis combat system aboard the USS Higgins and USS Howard had achieved an 88% TACT interception rate against a saturation attack of hypersonic and ballistic missiles. Without the shield provided by the Navy destroyers, the death toll at Kadena would have been measured in the hundreds, and the primary runway would have been rendered unusable for weeks instead of hours. The technological investment in the Standard Missile-6 and the AN/SPY-6 radar had been validated in the most violent way possible. At Kadena Air Base itself, the recovery was moving into its final phase. The Red Horse engineering teams had successfully patched the primary taxiways using 500 tons of rapid-setting polymer, allowing the first refueling tankers to move toward the northern hangars. The smell of fresh asphalt and concrete now dominated the southern flight line, covering the lingering scent of the morning's fires. The 14 aircraft that had been lost were being replaced by a transition of assets from the continental United States, including a full squadron of F-35 Alphas arriving from Utah within the next 48 hours. At sunset, a brief and somber ceremony was held in front of the 18th Wing headquarters. The base flag, which had been torn by the initial blast wave, was replaced with a fresh one. The commanding officer spoke for less than 5 minutes, focusing not on the destruction they had witnessed, but on the speed and professionalism of the response. He noted that while the concrete could be patched and the planes replaced, the resolve of the personnel on the island was a variable the enemy had failed to account for. The geopolitical landscape of the Pacific had been permanently altered. The Kadena strike proved that the era of sanctuary bases was over, and that every American installation within 3,000 kilometers of the Asian mainland was now a frontline position. The 7th Fleet and Pacific Air Forces had established a permanent 24-hour combat air patrol that stretched from the Aleutian Islands to the south China Sea. The silence that fell over Okinawa as the sun dipped below the horizon was not the silence of peace, but the heavy, watchful stillness of a superpower that had been struck and had struck back with even greater force. The United States military had achieved its primary objective. The base remained operational. The retaliatory strikes were successful, and the regional alliance with Japan had been forged into a wartime partnership. The price had been 14 aircraft and 15 lives. But the message sent to the world was clear. The Pacific defense architecture was resilient, distributed, and ready for whatever followed the dawn of the 12th of January, 2026.